She was only 5 years old, too young to understand betrayal, too small to fight back, and too innocent to realise that the people hurting her were the same ones calling themselves Mum and Dad. But the worst part, it was all caught on camera. A silent witness mounted on her bedroom wall, recording not bedtime stories, but bruises, not lullabies, but screams. And for hours, yes hours, it captured a nightmare unfolding in real life. This isn't just a story of unimaginable abuse. It's the story of how a system heard her cry and looked away. This is the case of Missy Mogle, and once you know what happened, you'll never forget her name. It started like any ordinary morning in a quiet suburban neighbourhood, but by the end of that day, the world would learn of a horror that defies comprehension. A 5-year-old girl, Missy Mogle, found unresponsive in her bedroom, her tiny body battered, starved, and filmed in silence by the very people who were supposed to love her most. This is not just a story of abuse. It's a searing indictment of how systems failed, how red flags were ignored, and how cruelty thrived behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. Welcome to Crime Teller Midnight. Today we're uncovering a case so heartbreaking it may haunt you long after the video ends. But we must tell it, not only to seek justice for Missy, but to confront the uncomfortable question, how did no one stop this? It began with a 911 call placed from a modest home in Tallahassee, Florida. Paramedics arrived to find Missy's grandfather frantically performing CPR on her tiny frame. She was rushed to Tallahassee Memorial Healthcare, where doctors fought to revive her, but they couldn't. She was gone, a child with her whole life ahead of her, extinguished not by accident, not by illness, but by months, if not years, of deliberate, systematic torture. When investigators turned their eyes toward the caregivers, her 23-year-old mother, Chloe Spencer, and her 35-year-old stepfather, Daniel Spencer, the stories they told seemed at first to cast Missy as a difficult child, prone to tantrums and breath-holding. But the inconsistencies in their accounts quickly unraveled. The truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Chloe and Daniel were arrested the very same day. The charges? Aggravated child abuse, child neglect, failure to report abuse, and ultimately a case that would evolve into something far more sinister: murder. But what truly broke this case wide open wasn't just forensic evidence or witness testimony. It was the cold, unblinking eye of a surveillance camera hidden in Missy's bedroom. Installed, perhaps, under the guise of monitoring behaviour, this camera would become the single most damning witness in a case that would shake the conscience of an entire community. What it recorded wasn't parenting. It was hell, documented hour by hour. Investigators described the footage as hours of abuse, a phrase that on its own sends chills down your spine. This wasn't a one-time loss of control. This was routine. This was deliberate. Daniel could be seen beating Missy, forcing her face into the bed. Chloe, her biological mother, stood nearby in one scene, holding an object, watching her daughter curled up in a fetal position, doing nothing to stop it. In that moment, complicity became undeniable. But this wasn't just visual horror. Missy's autopsy revealed bruises across her entire body: arms, legs, back, buttocks. The bruises varied in colour, some fresh, others fading, signalling abuse that wasn't just prolonged, but normalised. There were ligature marks on her wrists, burns on her fingers, and perhaps most heartbreaking, clear signs of malnutrition. Missy wasn't just beaten, she was starved, not fed enough to grow, not cared for enough to survive. How does a child endure so much and yet be invisible to the world? How did this suffering continue unchecked? As authorities sifted through the footage, They began to understand that Missy's bedroom had not been a sanctuary, but a stage of relentless torment. This surveillance camera, intended perhaps to blame the child or prove some misguided point, did something far more powerful. It bore witness to cruelty in its rawest form. Investigators watching the videos were visibly shaken. Some had to take breaks during the review, not from fatigue, but from the sheer emotional toll of watching a small child being treated with such indifference and malice. Daniel Spencer, the man who claimed Missy had simply thrown a tantrum, could be seen in the video beating her repeatedly, his rage cold and mechanical. Chloe Spencer, her mother by blood but not in spirit, appeared more than once, sometimes passive, sometimes armed with an object, looming near her daughter, like a shadow of inaction and complicity. In some scenes, she simply watched. In others, she prepared to strike. There was no concern in her eyes, no maternal instinct kicking in, no moment of doubt, just silence. A mother watching her child suffer and doing nothing. It's the kind of footage that doesn't just make a prosecutor's case, it makes you question humanity itself. But even without the camera, Missy's body told a heartbreaking story. Her injuries weren't from a single night of abuse. They were a timeline, a history written in bruises. Some purple and swollen, others faded into sickly yellows and greens. Her wrists bore signs of being tied. Her fingertips were burned, tiny scars on soft skin that should have only known crayons and sunlight. And then came the revelation that felt like a knife twist. She had been starved. Her little frame, fragile and underweight, showed unmistakable signs of malnutrition. This wasn't just child neglect. It was slow, sustained torture. The people who should have fed her, nurtured her, protected her, they didn't just fail. They weaponized her vulnerability. They transformed care into cruelty. When confronted with the footage and medical evidence, Chloe's lies began to collapse. She admitted that Daniel, her partner, had been hitting Missy with a belt twice a day. Not once, not occasionally, twice. Every single day. Weeks of this routine. She also admitted he had been using drugs. Daniel, on the other hand, did what so many abusers do. He pointed the finger back. He claimed Chloe was responsible. The classic mutual blame game began. But there was no defense strong enough to shield them from the reality captured on camera. No legal strategy could undo hours of visual proof. No alibi could explain away a starving child, filmed while suffering. What emerged wasn't just a case of a child dying from neglect. It was a documentary of torment, a timeline that prosecutors could present frame by frame. But what's even more soul-crushing is that it didn't have to end this way. There were chances, so many chances, and yet every single one was missed. Missy Mogle's death was not a random tragedy. It was the inevitable conclusion of a series of institutional blind spots, delays, and rationalizations. The people meant to protect her saw the signs, every bruise, every accusation, every documented warning, and still allowed her abuser to walk freely into the same home to continue the cycle. And when Daniel Spencer was released on bond in April 2025, despite being convicted in a child sex case, it wasn't just an error, it was a moral failure with a death toll. Even State Attorney Jack Campbell, the very person prosecuting the case, publicly questioned how such a decision could happen. His words were clear. I don't understand how someone who pled guilty in a child sex case can be out on bond. And we echo that confusion. Missy didn't just fall through the cracks. She was pushed through them by a system that refused to hold abusers accountable when it mattered most. And though the judge may have had legal reasons, technicalities, procedures, discretionary guidelines, none of them shielded Missy from what followed. No clause or statute can justify allowing a convicted predator to return to a home with children, especially when one of those children had already spoken up. And yet, the law did exactly that. This is why Missy's story isn't just a courtroom drama or a police report. It's a mirror that reflects what happens when rules override empathy, when bureaucracy becomes a wall rather than a safety net. Her death wasn't a mystery. It was a culmination. And behind that horror is a question we cannot ignore. How many more children like Missy are we failing right now? Simply because we're not listening? Because we trust procedure more than instinct? Because we're afraid of stepping in until it's too late? Missy told the truth. Her small voice was full of fear and honesty. And what did we do? We turned away. And that is why her story must be told, not just to remember her, but to prevent the next silence from becoming another obituary. After the funeral flowers had wilted, after the public outrage started to fade, the legal system began to move, but slowly and under immense scrutiny. Chloe Spencer and Daniel Spencer, once just names on a birth certificate and a mailbox, became defendants in one of the most disturbing child abuse cases the state had ever seen. Initially charged with aggravated child abuse and neglect, it didn't take long for the evidence, especially the footage from Missy's room, to shift the tone of the case entirely. Prosecutors upgraded the charges to second-degree murder, a move that signaled this wasn't just about poor parenting or reckless behavior. It was about a pattern, a decision, an intentional failure to protect. And while Daniel and Chloe both pleaded not guilty, the mountain of evidence was already casting long shadows over their defense. The camera didn't just show physical violence. It showed indifference. It showed duration. It showed intent. These weren't impulsive acts of frustration. They were systematic. The prosecution team, led by State Attorney Jack Campbell, made it clear. They would not rule out seeking a first-degree murder charge, especially against Daniel. Why? Because of what the law calls felony murder, when a death occurs during the commission of another felony, like child abuse. And with footage of Daniel hitting Missy, with proof of malnutrition, with weeks of repeated abuse, all documented, the elements were falling into place. It was no longer just a question of whether Daniel harmed her. The question became whether that harm was deliberate, sustained, and ultimately fatal. As for Chloe, her legal fate is murkier. She's Missy's biological mother, the person society expects to be the final line of protection. And yet, she stood silent. She admitted Daniel beat Missy. She knew about the belt. She knew about the drugs. She knew her daughter was wasting away, both physically and emotionally. Yet she stayed, and so did Missy. Prosecutors are weighing whether to pursue manslaughter, accomplice to murder, or even full co-conspirator charges. And there's talk of a plea bargain. If Chloe agrees to testify truthfully against Daniel, if she can convincingly prove she was also a victim, manipulated and controlled, she might earn a lesser sentence. But that option raises bitter questions. Can a mother who watched her child fade into bones and bruises truly be excused, even partially? Is cooperation worth forgiveness? The court may offer mercy, but public opinion won't. Meanwhile, the defense is scrambling. Legal experts predict they'll attack the video, perhaps claim it's misunderstood, edited out of context, or that Chloe was powerless under Daniel's control. But this isn't a case of discipline gone wrong. This isn't an overreaction, it's abuse, recorded in real time. And no matter how skilled the lawyers are, no jury will easily forget what they see with their own eyes. Forensic reports, surveillance footage, hospital data, witness testimony. Every piece is stacking, frame by frame, like a documentary of decay. And through it all, Missy remains voiceless. Her screams now pixelated memories. Her injuries now evidence. Her absence now an open wound. As prosecutors prepare their case and the defense searches for any path toward mitigation, the legal terrain becomes more complicated, not just legally, but morally. Chloe Spencer, the mother whose silence was louder than any scream, now stands at a critical crossroads. Her attorneys are reportedly exploring the possibility of a plea bargain, a legal agreement that would exchange her full cooperation for a lighter sentence. If she agrees to testify against Daniel, to recount every detail of the abuse she allowed, witnessed, or participated in, the prosecution may reduce the charge from second-degree murder to manslaughter or even negligent homicide. But this is no ordinary plea deal. This is a question of whether a mother who watched her daughter deteriorate, who lived in the same house as monsters and perhaps became one herself, deserves a deal at all. Could society ever accept such an arrangement? Can the law truly measure the weight of her inaction? And what message does it send when someone entrusted with a child's life walks away with a lesser punishment in exchange for courtroom testimony? Attorney Michael Go-Tottle, one of the legal analysts following the case, notes that plea bargains are standard tools in criminal law. They ensure convictions and allow prosecutors to secure cooperation from lesser offenders in pursuit of the more dangerous ones. And by many standards, Daniel Spencer is clearly the bigger threat, violent, manipulative, and with a history that stretches far beyond Missy. But Chloe isn't a bystander. She's Missy's mother, the person who brought her into this world. And for many, her betrayal is deeper than any bruise left on that child's body. Legal experts argue that if Chloe can prove coercion, if she can show patterns of domestic violence, emotional control, isolation, she may earn sympathy. But sympathy isn't justice, and her child is still dead. The public, already enraged by the system's previous failures, may not stomach the idea of mercy for a mother who stood beside a belt-wielding addict and said nothing. And then there's Daniel. His defense is unraveling before the trial has even begun. With video evidence, medical reports, and even Chloe's own admission that he beat Missy twice daily, he is not just in a weak legal position, he's in an indefensible one. Any strategy his lawyers employ, whether trying to discredit Chloe, deny the intent, or blame addiction, will have to stand against the cold, unfeeling gaze of the camera. Cameras don't forget, cameras don't flinch, and this one watched it all. The defense might argue that Chloe was the enabler, that she manipulated Daniel or failed to feed Missy out of neglect rather than intent. But these arguments all circled the same painful truth. Neither parent lifted a finger to save her. Both are guilty, even if their guilt wears different masks. The prosecution knows that their case will hinge not just on the facts, but on the jury's ability to hold both parents accountable in different ways. And they'll be asking a heavy question. How do we assign blame when silence can be just as deadly as violence? While the court system gears up for what may become a precedent-setting trial, there's another story unfolding, quieter, less covered by the media, but equally important. It's the story of 3 children, Missy's siblings, whose lives were shattered by the same horror that ended hers. These are not just footnotes in the case file. These are real kids, innocent, confused, traumatized. They lived under the same roof. They saw more than anyone ever should. And now, they're in state care, separated from the only family they've known. But not forgotten. In the background of this legal chaos, Missy's maternal grandparents have stepped forward, not just to grieve, but to fight. They're working tirelessly through the courts to gain permanent custody of the remaining children, determined to give them a home that is finally safe, finally loving, and finally free from fear. These grandparents, once on the periphery of this nightmare, are now at its centre, pushing against bureaucracy and emotional exhaustion to save what's left. The state's Department of Children and Families has placed the children under protection, but placement is temporary. Long-term custody involves hearings, background checks, home evaluations, and legal navigation that few grandparents are prepared for. Yet they press on. Because they must. They're doing what Chloe and Daniel never did, putting the children first. And while their battle continues in the shadows of the main trial, their actions may offer the only redemption this story can hold. But even if custody is granted, even if these children find safety, the scars will remain. The trauma of watching abuse, or living through it, doesn't fade with a court order. It lingers. It festers in nightmares and trust issues, and in the silence children adopt when the world has already shown them that speaking up doesn't always save you. That's why the responsibility doesn't end with this family. It extends to every agency, every school, every hospital that overlooked the signs. Because Missy wasn't the only one at risk. She just happened to be the one who died. Her siblings are the living proof that this family was on fire long before anyone saw the smoke. And while the courts sort through degrees of murder, while lawyers debate over intent and plea bargains, these kids are waking up in unfamiliar beds, asking unfamiliar adults if they're allowed to feel safe now. The community that failed Missy has a second chance with them, to do better, to pay attention, to ensure that their future isn't just a quieter version of Missy's past. The grandparents, grieving but relentless, are doing their part. The rest of us must ask, will we do ours? As news of Missy Mogle's death spread beyond Tallahassee, the story ignited a national wave of heartbreak, outrage, and demands for change. Memorials sprung up in public gardens, outside the courthouse, and even near her former school, places she should have returned to, with scraped knees and finger-painted drawings, not with candlelight vigils and hand-drawn posters that read, "Justice for Missy." The public didn't just mourn. They organised. Online petitions gathered tens of thousands of signatures calling for accountability, not just from Chloe and Daniel, but from the very institutions that allowed them to continue. The Florida Department of Children and Families came under intense scrutiny, with people demanding an internal audit of every decision made in Missy's case, from the day she reported her stepfather to the moment they closed the file and walked away. Community activists questioned how DCF could justify relying on a simple signature to promise Missy's safety, as if a dangerous home could be undone with a promise on paper. They demanded to know why a mother's word was enough to override a child's cry. Others turned their fury toward the court system, especially Judge Tiffany Baker Carper, whose decision to release Daniel Spencer on bond after he pled guilty in a separate child sex crime became a flashpoint of criticism. How could someone convicted of trying to meet a minor for sex be allowed to return home? How could any judge sign that order and sleep at night? State Attorney Jack Campbell echoed these frustrations in interviews, making rare and candid remarks about how baffled he was by the court's leniency. "I don't understand," he said plainly, and in those words he spoke for the nation. Legal experts, social workers, and advocates began asking deeper questions, not just about this case, but about how many others like it might be quietly festering in the background. They warned that Missy was not an isolated case, that there are other children right now, living with the same terror, waiting for someone to believe them, waiting for someone to act. In the weeks following her death, Tallahassee saw town hall meetings, legislative proposals, and renewed calls for child welfare reform. But progress, as always, is slow. Bureaucracy defends itself with jargon and procedure. Courts resist blame, agencies close ranks, And in the meantime, Missy is still gone. Her story continues to haunt not just because of its cruelty, but because of how preventable it was. This wasn't a child who slipped through the cracks. She was standing in them, waving her arms, shouting for help. And still, nothing. And so the public response became more than grief. It became a demand for overhaul. People wanted new laws, new training, new oversight. They wanted children's voices to be given the weight they deserve. They wanted judges to weigh safety more heavily than procedural leniency. They wanted to make sure that the next Missy doesn't just become another courtroom name. And in that public fury, there is hope, because sometimes tragedy sparks reform. Sometimes the worst stories force a system to look in the mirror. But change doesn't come on its own. It has to be pushed. And Missy's story is now part of that push. In the aftermath of Missy Mogle's death, legal experts and child welfare professionals began stepping forward, not just to analyse the case, but to confront its broader implications. Attorney Michael Go-Tottle, a respected voice in child protection law, gave a sobering assessment. This was a textbook example of systemic failure. According to him, every red flag was there, and yet no one connected the dots. He pointed to the July 2024 abuse report, the one where Missy herself accused Daniel of choking and touching her, and asked the question many were afraid to face. Why wasn't she removed from the home immediately? Why did DCF settle for a voluntary agreement instead of taking action that would have saved her life? Go-Tottle acknowledged that legal decisions are rarely simple, that judges and caseworkers must often navigate a web of policies, procedures, and thresholds of evidence. But even he admitted this wasn't a grey area. This wasn't a close call. It was a blazing alarm bell, ignored. He also addressed the controversial decision to release Daniel on bond after his guilty plea in the child sex sting operation. According to him, the felony conviction alone should have warranted pre-sentencing detention, especially with children in the home. He emphasised that courts often weigh risk based on history, and Daniel's history wasn't just concerning, it was dangerous. And yet, a bond was granted, and a child died. Go-Tottle did caution the public against assuming that every actor in the system acted out of malice or incompetence. He explained that many caseworkers are undertrained, under-resourced, and overwhelmed by caseloads that make deep investigations difficult. Some welfare checks may have been conducted, but signs of abuse can be hidden. Bruises covered by clothes, children coached to remain silent. And yet, even with that context, he maintained a hard truth. The system failed because it wasn't built to intervene fast enough. The procedures are too slow, the protections too brittle, the accountability too weak. His solution: reform. Real, structural, uncomfortable reform. He called for mandatory video reviews in abuse cases, enhanced tracking of prior offenders, stronger penalties for breaking child custody agreements, and perhaps most importantly, legislation that mandates a second layer of review when a child accuses someone of abuse. Because the worst thing that can happen isn't believing a lie, it's dismissing the truth. And Missy's truth was dismissed. That's the core wound in this story, not just the beatings or the malnutrition or the video footage, but the way her truth was minimized by every adult who heard it. In courtrooms, in social service offices, in whispered conversations, her truth was questioned, diluted, ignored. And so she became a statistic. Another 5-year-old girl failed by people who were supposed to fight for her. But Go-Tottle's final message was one of cautious hope. He said that tragedies like Missy's, while horrific, often become the catalysts for real change. That public outrage can translate into policy. That sometimes the death of one child can protect hundreds more. But only if we listen. Only if we change the laws, not just the headlines. Because if nothing changes, Missy's death won't just be a tragedy. It'll be a warning we ignored. Again, when the final chapter of a child's life is written by abuse, silence, and institutional failure, it's easy to feel like justice is an impossible word. But Missy Mogle's story didn't just end with her last breath, and that's something the people who knew and loved her refuse to let happen. In the weeks following her death, something changed, not just in the legal system or the media, but in the community's spirit. Neighbours who had never spoken before gathered for vigils. Strangers who had never met Missy cried over her story, and people from every background, teachers, social workers, parents, asked the same thing. How did we let this happen? The answer is complex, but the outcome is simple. A 5-year-old is gone, and her death has become a mirror for an entire society. We see now that it wasn't enough to rely on systems, forms, or signatures. We see that safety isn't promised by a signed document or a custody plan. It's earned through vigilance, compassion, and courage to act even when it's uncomfortable. And while Missy won't walk into another kindergarten class or blow out her 6th birthday candles, her legacy might still become something powerful, if we allow it to be. That legacy is found in the legislation being drafted in her name. It's in the renewed training protocols for social workers. It's in the uncomfortable conversations being held in living rooms and state houses alike. Her face, once framed by innocent joy, is now a symbol of vulnerability, of injustice, but also of awakening. In every town hall where a parent demands better screening, in every caseworker briefing that reminds agents to look twice, in every school staff meeting where a teacher is reminded to ask hard questions, Missy is there, not in person, but in purpose. Her story has pierced the barrier between tragedy and transformation. But the truth is, transformation only happens if we keep speaking. If we turn this pain into policy, if we honour her not with hashtags and headlines, but with action. There are hundreds of thousands of children like Missy across the country, many with bruises no one sees, many with stories they're afraid to tell, many still believing that adults will help if they're just brave enough to speak. We owe them more than belief. We owe them protection. And we owe Missy our commitment, not just to punish the people who hurt her, but to ensure that what happened in that bedroom, what was caught on camera and etched into our collective conscience, never happens again. Her name must not fade. Her image must not be replaced by the next tragedy. She should be the reason we change, the reason we wake up, the reason we act. Because Missy Mogle was not just a victim. She was a little girl, a daughter, a classmate, a life that mattered. And now, whether we want it or not, she's a legacy we have to live up to. And now, as we reach the final chapter of this devastating story, we're left with more than just a case file or courtroom testimony. We're left with a responsibility. Because while Missy Mogle's life was cut short in the most painful and unjust way imaginable, her voice, captured in that heartbreaking call to child services, echoed through every bruise, every silent night under the eye of a blinking camera, still speaks. She reminds us of how fragile trust is when placed in the hands of people who don't deserve it. She reminds us that being a parent doesn't begin with biology, but with protection. That systems built to keep children safe must be more than checklists and signatures. They must be responsive, courageous, and willing to act even when it means confronting monsters in plain clothing. The final takeaway from Missy's life isn't just about punishment. It's about prevention. It's about asking hard questions of our courts, of our schools, of our child protection services, and demanding better answers. It's about believing children when they speak up, especially when their stories are difficult to hear. Because if a 5-year-old can find the bravery to report abuse, the adults listening must find the courage to act. It's about accountability, not just for Chloe and Daniel, but for every layer of the system that let her down. It's about ensuring that the next case isn't buried in paperwork, or ignored out of disbelief, or lost to procedural apathy. And it's about looking around at the world we live in and realizing that Missy was never alone. She was just unheard. Until now. So as we close her story, don't let her name become another headline that fades with time. Carry it. Share it. Teach it. Let Missy Mogle become the reason a social worker pushes harder. The reason a teacher asks that extra question. The reason a neighbour picks up the phone. The reason a child, somewhere, right now, gets to live. If her suffering can spark change, if her loss can wake a system and inspire a movement, then her life, short as it was, will echo far longer than her final breath. So we say her name, we carry her memory, and we commit to building a world where no child ever has to die just to be believed. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for choosing not to look away. If this story moved you, please share it. Let Missy's voice keep reaching those who need to hear it. Because silence let this happen. But awareness can make sure it never happens again.